One of the questions that I want to ask, and of course, I know you don't have a crystal ball, Andrew. I wish you did, but will the outcomes of these trials impact the social justice movements that are going on across the United States?
I don't think it makes any difference, because I don't think the point of these prosecutions is actually conviction. I mean, of course, if they get a conviction, they'll take it and they'll crow about it. They'll be very happy about it. But I think the real purpose of these prosecutions is purely political, and they get the political benefit whether or not they get the conviction. So I mentioned earlier that in the Zimmerman case, the local prosecutors wouldn't take Zimmerman to trial. It was clearly self-defense, so they had to get a prosecutor from out of the district. That prosecutor, Angela Corey, was running for re-election. She was not going to win re-election because the black people in her community didn't like her because of some unpopular prosecutions she'd made against other black people in the community. She was going to lose re-election. She prosecuted George Zimmerman for the shooting death of Trayvon Martin. Now, instead of protests against her in the community, she was at the head of protests. She was at the head of marches against George Zimmerman. So she was back in favor. She lost the case. George Zimmerman was acquitted. So on the legal merits, that's a loss. But she won re-election. So when people say Angela Corey lost that case, I have to ask, well, how do you define win or loss? Because if the real concern is a political concern, well, she won that fight. She won her re-election, which was, I think, the real point of the prosecution. Now, if she'd gotten a conviction, of course, she would have been very happy. But the conviction would have been icing on the cake. That wasn't the real purpose. The real purpose was political capital. And I think that's the real purpose here. I think even if Rittenhouse gets acquitted, the fact that they put him through this process is going to have a chilling effect on anybody else who might want to do what Rittenhouse did. Show up as some kind of citizen militia protecting property in the face of riots. Who's going to do that if they know that even if they have all the legal merits on their side and ultimately would be acquitted at trial, they're going to have to spend a couple of their years of their life going through this kind of process? Who's going to make a citizen's arrest after the Ahmaud Arbery case? So whether or not people get convicted or not, I think is somewhat besides the point. If I'm correct that the real purpose of these things is really political and not legal.
Well, I guess my concern is, and I said this in 2020, I said, guys, don't act like the riots are over. If Kyle Rittenhouse is acquitted, we could see rioting. If Officer Rolfe is acquitted, we could see rioting again, maybe even worse than before. Because if you think back to, for those of us that are old enough to remember the Rodney King situation, the Rodney King videotape is released in March of 1990, but the riots didn't occur until the officers were acquitted. That's when the real burning and looting and deaths occurred. So I think that we could see, maybe I'm wrong, hopefully I'm wrong, that with the Jacob Blake officers and everyone involved, as these officers get acquitted, and rightfully so for most of them, I think we're going to see a lot more looting and burning. That's my opinion. What do you think?
Well, I think you're certainly right that if there's an acquittal, that can readily act as a catalyst for more rioting and looting. But I think we live in a different era than Rodney King. I don't think the catalyst is required. I mean, listen, riots and looting were happening before these trials were occurring. So there's always going to be some existing allegation of a wrongful killing that took place, either by officers or by citizens, because there's too much money to be made. So this is, you have to think of it as being orchestrated. So once one case is settled, either by an acquittal or a conviction, and whatever the immediate consequences of that are, I can assure you within 3 to 4 weeks, there'll be another one. Because we live in a country of 330 million people. There's lots of bad guys, and there's lots of cops, and there's lots of citizens, and there's lots of interactions. And they'll simply scan through the news. They'll set up a Google alert, just like I have Google alerts for these cases, and they'll see one. All right, folks, we've all had a vacation since the last propaganda effort. Everyone's back at the job now. Let's find our next news story to propagandize. And they'll just pick one because it doesn't have anything to do with the actual underlying legal merits. It just has to be a sufficient fuel to power another propaganda initiative. And then we'll just have another one. It'll be Joe Smith. It doesn't matter. We're never going to be in a time where the people who are profiting from this, both in terms of money and political capital, are simply going to say, yeah, we don't want more money. We don't want more political capital. We're just not going to do this anymore. As long as it's profitable, they're going to keep doing it. So it's never going to stop.